Welcome. It's great to be with each of you today, made possible by lots of electronics in these weird and trying times. My name is Gwed Adams, and I am coming to you from Anchorage, Alaska. I'm the founder of an anti-trafficking organization called Priceless. It's a huge privilege to get asked to speak to a group of people around the most dark, vile things in our culture, the world of sex trafficking, because I feel at home. I feel like I'm with people as odd as I am. And that does make us all kind of an odd bunch together. But your oddness is increased by the fact that your leaders who asked me to come and teach to you today asked that I would explore the scripture in Judges chapter 19. That makes them oddballs as well. This is a doozy of a scripture. It's one that I would never have just picked out and said, boy, this is going to be a fun one to preach on. And my goal today is to look at the darkness of sex trafficking out of this sex trafficking scripture and the world today, looking at trafficking in the United States, which is now positioned number one with Mexico in the whole world for the buying and selling of children and men and women for sex and sexual torture. Once I have ruined you for ordinary, I want to come back together and fill you with fire and hope that our world can and will change, and you just may be the catalyst for that change. Here's what I know. The war against this kind of slavery won't be won and lost by electing different kinds of government officials and putting different leaders in place. It's not going to be won and lost by passing new laws. It's not going to be won and lost by leveraging millions of dollars in grants to all kinds of nonprofit organizations across the country. Those things are good. I hope they continue. But that's not where the battle is won or lost. It's not going to be won or lost if we start thousands and thousands of social service organizations and running lots and lots of community awareness events. The church, your church, the Evangelical Covenant Community Church of North America, is not only a nice addition to the fight in trafficking, the church is the only hope. Now let's look at the 19th chapter of Judges, where we find this horrific trafficking story. And I'm just going to tell you the story and not take the time to read this whole passage of Scripture. But I do want to encourage you to read it, but don't just stop at chapter 19. Go on through the next several chapters to see the ending of this story. I think it applies a lot more than just this one little chapter. But I'm going to pull one nugget out of it for you today. So there was this Israelite man. He was from the tribe of Judah, and he marries a woman also from the tribe of Judah. She was living in Bethlehem at the time, but she becomes unfaithful, and she goes back to, Scripture doesn't tell us much more than the fact that she was unfaithful, and she left and went back home. And she went back home to Bethlehem. Well, this guy decides to go get her again. So he goes back to Bethlehem, travels from the hill country in Ephraim, and travels to Bethlehem to get his wife. The scripture here says concubine, but what that really means is wife. It's just a wife that couldn't pay the bride price. So concubine and wife are interchangeable in that context. So he goes and gets his wife back, and the father says, "Oh, just stay, have some more food with us, stay for a while." So he does. That stay extends for another 2 or 3 days. And finally, this Israelite man says, "No, I have to go," even though it was late in the day. So he and his wife and their 2 donkeys and maidservant headed out kind of late in the evening and heading back to the hill country of Ephraim. Well, they come upon the first town, and they decide that it's not safe enough to stay there because there aren't really Israelite people staying there. So it would be too dangerous to stay there. So they press on into the night. They finally get to a town that they feel might be safe with Israelite people. And there's no place for them to stay, so they just kind of set up right there in the courtyard. And this man approaches them and says, "Where are you from and where are you going?" He says, "Well, we're coming from Bethlehem and we're going to the hill country of Ephraim. That's where I'm from." And he says, "That's where I'm from too. You guys should come and stay in my house." And so they go to stay in his house. They've had a nice dinner. They're relaxing. And all of a sudden, there's some pounding on the door. And the men of the city, several men of the city, have come to the house and are asking the owner of the house, please send out this man so that we can rape him the whole night through. Well, mistreating a guest in your home is a big deal back in that age. So this man says, please don't do this vile thing. You guys have to leave him alone. But they persist. They knock. They persist. They're not giving up. And so he finally goes out and says, listen, I'll tell you what. I'll give you my virgin daughter, and this man is going to give you his wife. You can take these two women and do whatever you want with them the whole night through, but do not lay a hand on this man. Well, they refuse, and they continue to pound on the house. And it becomes a dire situation where they know everyone in the house is probably, their lives are going to be ended at this point. And so this man takes his guest's concubine and shoves her out the door and shuts the door. So they finally relent. They take her away and abuse her the whole night. In the early morning light, she comes back to the house and makes it all the way back to the house and dies right there in the threshold. They open the door and see her there, and actually her husband tells her, let's get up, we need to go. And she's unresponsive. So he realizes she's dead. He loads her back up on the donkey and carries her back to his hometown and does something that's pretty astonishing. He cuts her body up into 12 pieces, and he mails a piece of her body to each of the 12 tribes of Israel with a note, basically saying, something has to stop. Well, all of the tribes are astonished by the package that they received, as you can imagine. So they all get together and they decide that they're going to bring this man in, hear his story, and listen to what he has to say about it. A war ensues. All of the tribes rise up against the tribe of Benjamin, and you can read about what happens in those battles. Basically, they're losing against the Benjamites until they retreat, pull away, and pray, which was a good idea. And then they go back out, and the Benjamites, their brothers, are delivered into their hands. Hundreds of people died. They don't have to look that far to see what happens when this kind of sin that's so perverted, so off the charts, beyond normal, begins to take over and well up inside. They just look over there to Sodom and Gomorrah, which are no more. That's where we get the term sodomy. And those towns were obliterated off the map for this kind of vile sin that's creeping up in the tribe of Benjamin. This is what happened. In the Israelite tribes, God's people, by the way, things began to just feel a little bit normal, or maybe not even normal, but a blind eye might have been turned. Like, okay, that's bad, but what are we going to do about it, right? So the rape of a visitor into town became not okay, but accepted. The rape of men on men. The only way to stop a crime was to trade a lesser than human, somebody who wasn't as important in their eyes, as a sacrifice. Why would it be okay to give your virgin daughter to protect a guest in your home? This odd, skewed sense of justice began to start creeping in. It just began to start permeating. And sometimes the most heinous sins, like the buying and selling of children for sex, starts with the subtle ways where it reaches an apex. And for a long time, it can go unnoticed. Well, there is that stuff that happens in the gang world, and I hope they catch those guys. We start hearing ourselves say things like, wow, that is horrible, but obviously it's pretty rare. Or, well, we'll always have the perverted among us. Or, I wonder what position those kids or those women put themselves in to become a victim of such a crime. And sometimes a wake-up call, like the mailing of body parts to every tribe in the nation, is simply warranted. A wake-up call. For me, I had that moment of awakening too, the moment that I went from, you know what, I would like to fight the crime of sex trafficking because it's horrible and it's bad and I don't like that it's happening. From that place to the place that I will give my life to fight this crime. I cannot live and breathe a normal life while this is happening in my home, my town, my country. That moment started for me with a woman that I will call Tia. My time with her started with months and months of just building trust over text messaging. She soon began to lean on these text conversations in a way that I knew that she was beginning to see me, whoever this woman was on the other side of the text, as somebody that she could tell her secrets to in the middle of the night. That I was somebody that she could somehow trust. After weeks of building this very tender relationship with her, she finally decided I could be trusted enough to help her get rescued out of the home of the trafficker that she was living with. She had been sold to her first trafficker by her husband, who had been picked up on assault charges for beating her. And he sold her and her two very young daughters, 3 and 5, to a trafficker on his way to prison. She tried to escape one night with her 2 girls in the dead of winter with no shoes in a cabin outside of town, and she was caught and forced to dig her own grave in the snow. This monster caught her, brought her and her 2 daughters back to this place where she dug the grave and pulled a trigger and a gun in the back of her head that fired a blank. When she realized that her life had been spared, she begged if he would just let her give her 2 daughters away to a private adoption. She would stay and do whatever he wanted to the rest of her life. And she did, for a long time. I walked with her through 4 stays at Alaska Psychiatric Institute and 21 suicide attempts. Getting to know her, starting to love her, felt like I was carrying a 100-pound sack of cement around. It was hard. I doubted every day that I had what it takes to love her well. I didn't see the world in any way the same way that she saw it. I asked her one night after another suicide attempt, why? Why are you so desperate to end your life? You're free now. And we were working hard to get her back on her feet and turn her life around. She loved animals. I was working hard to get her a spot volunteering at the animal shelter and maybe even get to a place where we could write letters to her daughters. And she said, because every time I close my eyes, I have the same image and it gives me nightmares and I cannot bear it anymore. So I asked her, with much regret, to tell me about the image that she saw when she closed her eyes. She had become pregnant several months after giving her daughters up for adoption, and in about her 7 months of pregnancy, she became less profitable and was complaining a lot about the pregnancy and the pain that it was causing and the discomfort, having to work as many times during the day as she was being forced to work. And her complaints led to a beating that she'll never forget. This monster of a trafficker pushed her to the floor and kicked her in the stomach until she went into labor. And she gave birth to a little baby boy on the bathroom floor. As she cradled that little baby, this trafficker walked in the room, grabbed the baby from her arms, said, "He's dead. It's a boy, he's dead," threw him in the trash can and took the trash bag and walked out of the room. Within 24 hours, Tia would be servicing clients again. But she couldn't close her eyes without seeing that image. She said this statement to me that was forever that wake-up call, that driving force for me. Tell me how God can create a life that never got to breathe a single breath of air. His life was an utter waste, totally forgotten, and no one will ever know. I made a promise to her that as long as I'm living, this baby that we named together Brian will have a voice, that he will speak. From a landfill outside of Anchorage, Alaska, in a trash can, plastic coffin, Brian's voice will be heard, just like this woman's voice was heard throughout the tribes of Israel. Enough is enough. I am here, we are here, and we hear you. We hear you to the voiceless girls that have never once had a chance to say no to what happens to their bodies. We hear you to the little boys by the hundreds and hundreds in my state alone with prolapsed rectums from abuse who will forever have to carry a colostomy bag on their sides. We hear you to the thousands and thousands of teen girls lured into trafficking through their own insecurities and desires and want to be loved. We hear you to the thousands of teen boys extorted through the internet to send videos and photos and money to monsters who lurk long enough to catch them in moments of curiosity and indiscretion. And who have to live with the threats or their indiscretions will be exposed to their schools and their parents. We hear you to single moms who needed money to feed children who made the horrible decision to sell themselves, but only found themselves under the control of a trafficker with no way out. We know you are there, and we hear you. We're coming for you, and we won't be silent. Today, 875 churches in the Evangelical Covenant Community Church hear you. What if? What if all 875 churches set aside 15 minutes each and every week to just pray against this evil until the walls started to come down? What if each church committed to walking with, loving on, and caring for just 3 survivors of trafficking over the next year? Paying for counseling, providing some start of community. That would mean 2,625 freed slaves would have a chance at a new life. What if? What if 10 of your churches started cyber searching teams that began to hunt for and reach out to potential victims of trafficking on the internet? What if 10 of your churches started teams of men to post ads and answer phones in a loving interruption and a conversation with would-be buyers of sex? What if we took these calls? And what if the men on the other side of the line who had families, who had positions of authority and power, maybe led some of the churches, what if they had this loving interruption to stop? What if 10 churches started internet awareness campaigns in your local schools and put an end to sextortion? What if you taught every single middle school and high schooler in your entire town how to identify a predator online? What if the Evangelical Covenant Community Church matched the 200 predators who are online at every given second with 200 church people that are also online in every given second, reaching out, offering hope to a teenager who's lurking around? I've often said, that's the latest unreached people group. What if an army of professionals was raised up in your churches to provide pro bono legal help, medical services, counseling, life skills support, and employment to survivors of trafficking or those vulnerable to be trafficked? What if each church developed a place where parents and grandparents who suspected that maybe when their loved ones may have been trafficked, but they can't get law enforcement to get involved because they have a runaway designation? What if your church provided a place that could help them begin to look and find evidence of criminal intent? What if 50 of your churches decided to fight this crime through prevention by partnering with local teen shelters to provide mentorship to homeless teenagers, disenfranchised teens, and those who are just about to age out of the foster care system. We know that 44% of them end up being victims of trafficking. What if 30 of your churches partnered with local law enforcement to build bridges of trust between victims of trafficking and law enforcement so they can and will seek justice and give testimony against their traffickers? What if 10 of your churches form groups to go into local strip clubs and offer support and care for dancers, listen to their stories, warn them about trafficking, and who regularly target dancers? Most dancers think it's their only option. What if your church showed them another way? What if you could end trafficking and take back the territory so firmly held by the enemy? What if? It might not be your fault. You didn't cause it. Maybe didn't even contribute to it in any way. But it is your problem. It is my problem. It is our duty to purchase freedom from those who are endangered, enslaved, and the price will be heavy. If you're like me, you will say that the task is too big, and you will be right. You will say that it's too daunting and it's way too dangerous, and again, you will be right. You will say that your life is too busy and these women, these people are too messy and they will require way too much time. And you will be right. You will say that you are too ill-equipped and untrained to step in. Again, you're right. But God. Isaiah chapter 61 says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, to release from darkness the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of the vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and provide those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord, for the display of his splendor." What if it's us? Thank you.